All right. Well, it's noon, so I'll just go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome again to the third session in the fall sequence of UCLA New Ventures Business of Bioscience Bootcamp. Thank you for joining us on your Friday afternoon. I'm Matthew Savare, per usual, and I will be your host for this evening and for the rest of this fall. This week, we've got a special treat in the form of the two partners from Corsica Life Sciences, Mike Iacoviello and Matthew Cook, presenting indication and prioritization and competitive analysis for life sciences technologies. As usual, I just wanted to give a quick overview of the schedule that we have remaining. We've already had the two sessions, pitching life sciences technologies and risk up front. Today we have indication prioritization. Next week we'll have pre-compliance, the compliance journey, or phrased another way, getting your medical device ready for regulatory clearance. We'll have a week break on the 10th, and then we'll be back on the 17th with the basics of licensing university IP to a startup. As usual, the Q&A function is still available on your desktops, so please submit questions as they occur to you. I will make sure to have gaps within the presentation so that you can ask questions. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Matt and Mike so that you can share your presentation for this week.
All right. Okay. Do we have that?
We've got it. Do you mind going to presentation mode though?
Yeah.
There we go.
All right, Matt, do you want to kick us off with some introductions, and then we'll jump right in?
Sure thing. Hi everyone, my name is Matthew Cook, one of the managing partners with Corsica Life Sciences. We are a boutique life sciences focused consulting company. I've been at this now for 20 plus years. Background prior to consulting was in a range of different healthcare disciplines, from academic publishing to consumer focused healthcare. My background from an academic standpoint is in genetics, bachelor's in genetics from the University of Liverpool. So very glad to be with the team today. As we go through the presentation, we have built this to try and generate some Q&A. So we have a couple of slides where we do have some, ideally we would be looking for some audience interaction. So we'll see if that works. If not, we'll just keep pushing through. But thanks for the invite. Glad to be here.
Excellent. And I'm Mike Iacoviello. I'm also a partner with Corsica. Matt and I started around the same time, about 20 or so years ago. I had a bit of a tour through consulting. My focus is on early commercialization and product asset strategy. Before consulting, I came from the bench, so PhD neurobiology from the University of Chicago, but very quickly made the transition from bench science over to consulting, and haven't looked back since. What we'll do today, so as Matt said, we'll go through a fairly interactive presentation. We'll start with just by setting up a little bit of the framework, a little bit of what we think about when we think about indication prioritization, when we're engaged by clients or working with folks that need to prioritize one thing or the other. And we'll talk about this as a flexible framework that can be used not just exclusively on indication prioritization, but really applied to any decision making that you might need to do, or at least many situations and scenarios. Matt, if you go to the next slide, indication prioritization. What are the types of indication prioritization? And as I said, this is a flexible framework that you can calibrate the input and some of the filters that you use throughout. And it can be product agnostic. You can just have a big question, which is, where is there opportunity in drug development? Where is there opportunity in pharma, biotech, in med tech? In that case, you're just looking for areas where there is a need, and you can think about the product later. You could also perform this exercise or apply this framework to a product focus situation. I have a product, and which diseases can we apply that to? And we have a few recent examples that we can speak to that, where we're looking at specifically in oncology. This comes up where we have an asset, which tumor, which tumor type, which indication. You can go product focus within a specific disease state. There are different flavors of tumor types here. We say prostate cancer. You can think about breast cancer, lung cancer, some of these tumor types or disease states that have multiple variation. You can apply the same thinking. And then asset prioritization, flipping it over and say, we have many assets. How do we decide against them? Now, what do you get from this? What do you get from an indication prioritization? Well, early stage product development decisions and trade-offs, which is, from an entrepreneurial perspective, we have a thing. What do we do with it? This is where you apply it. We have a technology. We have a platform. What are the various options that are available to us? And then how do we select from one or the other? And we'll talk about how to set those filters and get down from a lot of options down to one or two and feel pretty good about where you land. Late stage life cycle management, where else? So once you have a successful product, where else can you go? Or investment decisions. Where do we want to place our bets? What do we want to acquire? And where do we want to grow from here? Now, that said, there's many ways to do it, but it all kind of looks the same. And we'll go through two frameworks here, which are varying in the levels of detail. And you'll see that there's some commonalities around them.
Yeah.
Matt, if you...
Yeah, I will. And I was actually just going to add one thing. In terms of why do it, it's a bit of it's kind of maybe people are thinking that's a bit of an obvious question, but I think particularly in our work, if you think about the tech world, and if the philosophy of product development in tech is so iterate, fail fast, iterate, fail fast. Our work is primarily focused in biopharma, a little bit less med tech. And the consequences of failure are very expensive, right? So in many respects, the objective behind indication prioritization is trying to do all we can to eliminate the chances of failure, right? And therefore, these do tend to be, for us at least, very extensive, very time-consuming assessments, because ultimately, we are trying to inform, certainly for clinical stage biopharma companies, significant investments. For the very early stage coming out of lab, science coming out of labs, preclinical, maybe the implications aren't quite as significant in terms of the investment decision, but you're still talking about where do we place our bets, and they're very important decisions. So as Mike said, the framework can flux, but in many respects, there's no secret sauce to this. It's one of those things where you just have to do the work, which from a consulting standpoint gives us business. But it's, there's no sort of secret sauce that we're going to cover today. It's more just how you frame up the work that you need to do.
And I will say, kind of building on that, Matt, 8 times out of 10, you're going to go through this process and you're going to look at the end and you're going to say, well, that makes sense, right? You could have intuitively gotten to the same place. But again, because these are really meant to drive investment decisions, and many times a lot of times it's your money, many times it's other folks' money. It's critical and imperative to show a structured process and a logical progression to get to that decision, and have the data to show that you've been thoughtful about where it is that you feel the opportunity lies. So in terms of framework, this is more of a linear process that we'll go through. We'll look in a second at a different way to look at it, but similar idea. And it all starts with identifying the universe of potential indications or potential options. What can we do? And drawing a line around where you're going to draw from these options. So you want to collect as much information as you possibly can there, build your master list, and then over the next 2 steps here where we have filtering criteria, start to make the big cuts. Are there any cuts that will eliminate large chunks of your list, right? Because you want to build the list and then very quickly whittle it down. You start with that large filter, you get to a short list of indications, and then you start the prioritization. Once you have a manageable number of options, now you start with the prioritization. You start to dig a little bit deeper, do a bit of a deep dive in the category, the attributes, the characterization, collecting that information, doing the secondary research. A lot of these projects that we do involve primary research as well. So we've done them in the past, and I think we'll talk about an example shortly where a lot of it was secondary research driven. Go out, do the research, build up your fact base, and use that to drive your decision making. A lot of times we overlay primary research with physicians, KOLs, other folks that are subject matter experts otherwise. We develop those profiles, we'll then score them. So we apply some score, some framework or construct to help us understand and translate all that information that we collected into some quantitative mechanism where we can say, quantitatively, not necessarily qualitatively, but quantitatively, where do these things lie in a prioritization? And if you select your criteria appropriately, it will reflect your objectives. It will reflect where you want to get to in the end. And that will help you take your short list down to a very short list of candidates. And then from there, you develop your business case, and you can either conduct the confirmatory primary research as we have here, or drive forward with your decision making. So this is one way to look at it. Really the process and the sequence of activities of getting from your universe of potential indications or potential options all the way down to a very short list of indications or options that you'll move forward with. Now, the other way to look at things, and I think a little more graphical representation, is a funnel. Right? We start with the big disease area of interest. We do the initial screen. We cut that down with our big first filter, and we identify what does an opportunity look like. What are the big defining features and characteristics? All right, we identify opportunity scoring. In this example, we used commercial and development. Those are two very common axes in which to evaluate opportunities and evaluate indications. And that is to say, commercial is what is the opportunity, so what's the return? Development is a proxy for investment, right? How hard are you going to have to work to capture a commercial opportunity? And again, these are completely flexible in terms of the scoring and the axes, and they just need to be thoughtfully reflected in what you're trying to do and what your ultimate goal and objectives are. So once you have this opportunity scoring, and we'll show you what that looks like, and different ways to visualize that and extract the insights, you then have the prioritization. You can then map your path forward and building it into an implementation. So we'll stop here. This is the basic framework, and for the rest of the next 45 minutes, we'll start to walk through some case studies that will apply these frameworks to various situations.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And one of the reasons we showed those two different frameworks is to make the point that there is no sort of right framework, right standard framework that you should always use. As Mike was saying, the key to this is flexibility and adaptability in those types of frameworks, and then change it to apply to your specific situation. So the rest of the slides we have are essentially running you through an example project. And we have maybe half a dozen slides in here that give you a sense of the framework that we used and the outputs that we generated. Because as we discussed, this is about doing the work, secondary research, primary research, compiling the information, and then putting that information through a framework to get a desired output. So, okay, case study for today. An RNAi platform-focused biotech. The platform that they have has the potential for targeting pretty much any disease or condition where RNAi knockout would apply. In the case of our engagement with this company, they were primarily focused in pulmonology and eye care. And they engaged us, and today, you guys, to conduct the assessment into where do we think are the biggest opportunities for an RNAi-based therapeutic in eye care. So that is the focus of today's case study. And to just give it some additional context in terms of the people who typically would be the client team on a project like this, certainly for a smaller company, it's the executive leadership of the key functions. So whether that's commercial, business development, medical affairs in this case, sometimes even CEO, given the nature of the work and the implications of it in terms of investment decisions. So the first question we would have for the team, and this would obviously be better if we were all sitting around a table, but okay, how do you get started? If anybody has any quick responses to that question, send them to Matthew and he can shout them out. We'll give people, what, 10, 15 seconds?
Just drop them in the Q&A if you feel so inclined.
And the clue, if there is an answer to this question, the clue comes from the two previous slides that we reviewed, which was these different frameworks, right? So how do you get started on any type of indication prioritization, whether you're working for a large biopharma company, you're working with a UCLA inventor and founder out of a lab, how do you get started on something like this?
I guess the first contribution is a question back to the group is to an audience member wanting to understand why did they narrow to eye delivery?
So in this case, they didn't narrow it to eye in terms of their own internal assessment. They just didn't have as much internal expertise in eye care. So that's what they engaged us on. They did their own assessments around pulmonology, oncology, I believe, cardiovascular, inflammation, many other disease areas. But eye care was an area where they didn't feel like they had sort of specific expertise to do the job well. We have a lot of prior experience in eye care, so we have a lot of expertise in that specific therapeutic area, hence why we did that piece of their much broader assessment. And then to the second sort of comment I see here in terms of build out a laundry list of potential indications. Yes, that's to come, but that's sort of, you jumped the gun a little bit there, I would say, in terms of just the thought process here. So in terms of how do you get started, define your process. Right? Every process for this type of assessment looks a little bit different. So we showed you two sort of general ones that we use as starting points, and we customize that given the therapeutic area that we're looking at, given the type of technology that we're looking at, and then also given sort of the requirements from on the client side in terms of the outputs of this work. So the specific framework that we used here is the first two pieces are the same as the general one that we reviewed. So within eye care as a therapeutic area, what are the broad areas of interest and how can we initially filter those based on some high-level criteria or high-level disease characteristics? Then how would you characterize the opportunity in each of those specific disease conditions? In this case, our third step is, okay, well, given RNAi as a therapeutic intervention, where do we think that would actually apply? Where do we think that RNAi would have promise, given specific characteristics around how you could treat a condition and how the tradition is currently treated? That then gave us a sort of further refined and targeted list which then we flowed through a commercial scoring and prioritization criteria. In this case, we chose a very simple scoring methodology that essentially had two criteria. It was just, what is the level of unmet need, and what is the competitive dynamics, competitive landscape. So is there an actual demand for some improvement in how a condition is treated, and how many other people are out there actually trying to pursue that? The reason we didn't go for the full commercial development long list of criteria, we have examples in here that we can show you how we've used that in other cases. But in this case, they were just trying to put some boundaries around, well, what are the types of conditions that we should be focusing our attention on from a research and discovery standpoint. So their need was a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily, okay, which indications do we want to pursue from a clinical standpoint? It was more, how should we be directing our research group to think about eye care as a potential therapeutic area? So again, criteria need to fit the need. So we're always striving to keep things as simple as possible while still being applicable. And in this case, an extremely simple approach did apply. So again, I would just encourage people there to give sufficient time to mapping out up front, how should we actually approach this, given what we're trying to get out of it. Okay, so this was the overarching framework that we moved forward with. So next question. If we are trying to define our initial disease areas of interest, you've just got to get that information. What information sources would you typically use? It's not a trick question. If anybody has any thoughts, there's more interesting questions, I agree. So maybe we can just skip to that one. In this case, it was very much a scientific literature type of review. So very much this first bucket in terms of understanding where we thought RNAi as a group, as a therapeutic intervention had potential applicability. So we had a deep dive into the scientific literature. We looked at all ongoing clinical trials around RNAi. We looked at preclinical information that we could find. We looked at other preclinical results around different MOAs and how other people had potentially looked at eye care through an RNAi lens, and just consolidated all of that information. How that ended up? Oh, actually, I missed an important point in terms of eye care. Now, the thing about RNAi, you can't really apply at the current time, and thinking about how you could introduce an RNAi therapeutic into the body, essentially, topical would be challenging. So there's a lot of front of the eye conditions and surface conditions that just wouldn't make sense from a modality standpoint. So one of the early decisions that we made was we need to be looking at back of the eye conditions, because essentially they involve an injection of the product into the eye, or systemically, potentially. So that immediately was a filter that we applied to severely limit the number of eye care conditions that we would look at. Again, that was specifically driven by an understanding of the platform technology that we were looking at, and what the requirements would be for that technology to have some kind of impact and therapeutic effect. So that led us to immediately prioritize a certain subset of eye care conditions, i.e. retinal conditions. We had 46, so all major back of the eye diseases. RNAi as a treatment is not really well suited to acute use. There's a lot of acute conditions in eye care that need sort of immediate attention. RNAi as a modality and a therapeutic intervention doesn't really apply. So all acute or surgically correctable conditions were removed. That took us down to 40. 36, diseases that require active treatment. Some eye care conditions just don't need to be treated. They're very slow progressing, for example, or they have some other element that just doesn't really require a therapeutic intervention. That took it down to 36. And then with all indication prioritization types of efforts. Epidemiology, number of patients, is a key component of that. In this era of rare disease and how very small patient populations still make commercial sense given the potential value that can be generated from a pricing strategy. Often now, even very, very small patient populations are still viable. So somewhat guided by the 36 conditions we were looking at and the epidemiology associated with those, we chose a cutoff of a 500 patient population. Anything less than that would be not commercially viable, which eliminated 3. And so the question comes in, how is 500 patients sufficient? Well, essentially that becomes sufficient because of 2 factors. One is often small indications from a patient epidemiology standpoint are viable if they're part of a broader portfolio. So this technology may have the application across a broad set of eye care conditions or retinal conditions. And as part of a basket of 3 or 4 different indications, then yes, it can be commercially viable. Or if you're thinking about gene therapy, for example, a course of gene therapy can be in the millions of dollars. So it can just be commercially viable from a pricing standpoint. So that's why 500 is admittedly small, but that's the cutoff that we decided to use. And so that set of 33 conditions was advanced to the next stage of the assessment. And this shows you how the board of conditions was prioritized per the previous methodology. So the 40 plus whatever down to the 33, the ones in the green is what was retained as part of the further assessment, and the red was deprioritized. Just to give you a sense of the volume of conditions and what that looked like. Okay. Like I said, I taught you through this methodology of how we got there, and it was more of just applying filters. Another example of how you can do this initial screen is using other metrics, right, and other criteria. So here's just another example of that. Here's a rheumatology example where, in this case, based on factors specific to the situation and the client organization and the therapeutics that were in question, mean age of onset and standardized mortality ratio was used as 2 criteria to prioritize and create some differentiation around the potential attractiveness of indications. Again, just to make the point, everything is very case specific. So just think through what makes the most sense in terms of how you create some differentiation and prioritization across the conditions and the disease areas that you're initially looking at. Mike, anything to add?
Yeah, so I think, just having gone through that first step in the case study where there's a number of different flavors and a number of different ways to get down to your first pass or your universe of opportunities and thinking about where are we going to start, I think that just really emphasizes the importance of taking a minute before you start the process and think about what are the steps that you need to take, what are your objectives from getting from the beginning through the middle and ultimately to the end, so that you can really just execute and as opposed to making these decisions along the way. And it makes it much easier to be able to map this out at the very beginning and think about how you're going to solve these problems and how you're going to define success.
Yep. And the next step in the process is a very important step and a very critical step that is often overlooked. So as we've been discussing up to now and looking at this slide where we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis, giant cell arteritis, ulcerative colitis, and then on the previous slide, we had a long list of eye care conditions. Okay, that makes sense, right? But very few products, very few technologies have application at a full disease area level, right? Typically, you need to understand what are these specific groups, segments, patient populations, call them what you will, within a specific disease area where we think there is true opportunity for the technology or the product in question. So to that end, what are the different ways of defining opportunities within a disease area, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, whether it's age-related macular degeneration? How do you take the next step? And oftentimes this is where these, particularly for early stage indication prioritization assessments, can go off the rails a little bit. I'll give you an example. We're engaged with an organization right now where some initial work was done around indication prioritization, and stroke was prioritized as a target indication. Well, there's different types of stroke, right? There's ischemic stroke, there's hemorrhagic stroke. And the work that they had previously done just didn't sufficiently go to sufficient depth to be able to truly quantify what the ultimate opportunity is, right? Any answers? If not, okay. So just for reference and for people to think through, there's probably 4 typical ways in which you can take a disease area and then narrow it down into specific segments of opportunity. Type of disease, fairly common, right? So within diabetes, type 1, type 2. Pretty easy example. Stage of disease doesn't apply everywhere, but in some cases, mild, moderate, and severe. Rheumatoid arthritis is probably a good one here, for example, that very few, certainly of the biologic products, very few biologics are indicated for mild rheumatoid arthritis. Typically, they're indicated for moderate to severe. So stage of disease, extent of disease is another way of cutting that down. Patient characteristic, maybe in oncology, for example, or some other conditions where characteristics of the patient do have a meaningful correlation to what the ultimate indication and therapeutic opportunity could be. So whether that's age or fitness performance status, for example, we do a lot of work in multiple myeloma. Fit and unfit is a very common branch of patient segmentation. And then the therapies that people are using. So whether it's first line, second line, third line, not just by line of therapy, but then also the type of therapy patients are progressing through as they go through the treatment flow and the disease pathway. That can also have a very meaningful impact on the size of the opportunity within a specific indication. So in these types of assessments, it's very important to go to that level, because otherwise you're just severely, not underestimating necessarily, but misrepresenting what the potential opportunity could be if you stay at that high level, right? Heart failure, no, you need to go down to the relevant subsets of heart failure to understand what the true opportunity is. And then also understand the next level of sort of characteristics that you would look at in terms of competitive landscape and everything else. All of that will then be looked at through that lens versus the top level. So these are the typical ways that you would then further segment the indication opportunities. How do you do that? This is where you just do the work, basically. We build fact sheets. This is just an example of the type of work that we do. Age-related macular degeneration, as an example, you've just got to pull the information. You just got to pull the information, understand the condition, and learn about it so you can understand how you do segment and further define a specific disease area to understand when you're prioritizing indications, what specifically is the indication that we are prioritizing. Just an example of what goes into it. Indication stratification, disease overview, epidemiology, straightforward, patient segmentation, therapeutic targets on the commercial side, treatment flow, market map, competitive landscape, stakeholders and drivers. Just a repository of information that allows you to then do what we just discussed. So in the eye care example, here's just an example of how that mapped out. Is what do we have here? 1, 2, 3, so 8 conditions where we further segmented the top line indication into sub indications that would be then important to look at from a prioritization standpoint. So if you take AMD as an example, there's early dry AMD, there's geographic atrophy, there's wet AMD. They are different types of AMD that it's unlikely that a therapeutic would have the same utility across those, or even if it did, the competitive dynamics are probably very different. So you would end up prioritizing that opportunity differently. I won't run through all of these, but it just gives some context for what we're talking about. And this is an important point because we often see this type of work not go to this level. And that's where I think sometimes there's a big opportunity missed in many respects in terms of understanding what the potential applicability of a technology is. Mike, anything to add on that piece?
No, not here, but coming up.
Okay. As we discussed already, every assessment needs to be customized and adapted to the specific product. If you are doing it from a product or technology-based viewpoint, which isn't always the case, but if you are, then things also need to be calibrated to the technology in question. So, question for the group, given what we're talking about eye care conditions, RNAi therapeutic, how can those disease areas be further filtered based on the technology promise and based on the technology that we're dealing with in this case? Any ideas? Okay.
Once again, feel free to use the Q&A function to submit any suggestions that you might have. Submitting anonymously is always an option.
We'll move on in the interest of time. So in this case, like I said, RNAi is a very sort of cutting edge. I mean, there are some FDA approved RNAi therapeutics now, but it's still a fairly cutting edge technology. And essentially what we did is just look at where are there specific characteristics of the disease condition in question that would potentially limit the opportunity or the need for RNAi as an intervention. So if you take sort of choroidal detachment as an example, so the unmet need is concentrated in hemorrhagic choroidal detachment, which requires surgical repair and is unlikely to be compatible with an RNAi therapy. So while that condition has a sort of a relatively high unmet need, if you will, the current intervention is surgery, and there's no real reason to think that RNAi would be more effective than the surgical intervention. So there's just the promise of RNAi in that indication just isn't really there, particularly when, should have mentioned this earlier, in the sense that when we do these assessments, when you do these assessments, we're primarily going to be looking at this from the where should we go first type of angle, right? Sometimes we do this also looking at life cycle management. In that case, other factors, other criteria, other things may be more important in terms of how we prioritize opportunities. But whenever you're looking at it in terms of where should we go first with the technology, you're looking for two things, right? You're looking for a high commercial opportunity and hopefully a relatively streamlined path to market, so to speak. And so anything where there's other things such as, well, surgical treatment is sort of the standard of care. The reason that can become a bit challenging is not only from the therapeutic side of things, but also you then get into things such as economics. Physicians often make money based on surgeries that they conduct, for example. So you just run into a different set of issues potentially in a situation where you're trying to displace surgery, as an example. So we went through the conditions that we had at this point, and we just looked for elements like that. How could we further eliminate things as potentially being sort of just not ideal indications to prioritize and focus on further. So again, just an example of, in our eye care case study, the things that we further eliminated.
So I just want to say here, and I want to go back to the fact sheets for a little bit and just make a point of practicality and thinking about this exercise, because the fact sheets are an important component of what we're doing. And in this case, we're putting the fact sheets in the middle of these filters. And ultimately, the fact sheets are a lot of work, right? That's when Matt said you just have to do the work, you have to build these fact sheets. So what your goal is in starting at this universe of possibilities and getting down to some manageable short list, from a work perspective, you want to try to eliminate things and only put in that work and only put in that time of building the fact sheets for those that really are true candidates for moving forward, or true candidates for an opportunity. So that's your goal kind of practically is get that list as short as possible using the filters that you can, so that when you do go and transition into this fact sheet and this deep dive into each of these areas, into the, as specific of a cut as you possibly can, that you've done as much work up front so that you're not building 100 fact sheets, because that would be unnecessary typically.
Yep. As we said at the outset, this is one of those types of assessments that is very labor intensive. So any way that you can also eliminate work as you go and the need to focus on things, just the better, essentially. Okay, moving on. Indication prioritization. One of the things that often comes to mind is the scoring side of indication prioritization, and that's obviously a very important piece, and that's what we can talk about now. And this is where you start to build some pretty charts as well, which is always quite satisfying. And so what criteria can be used to score and prioritize disease areas of interest? Again, not a trick question. Anybody have any initial thoughts or suggestions on things that they would typically look at? Unmet needs, spot on. That's always in there. The challenge with unmet need is actually how you define it. As a criteria, that's always in there. The trick with unmet need is, what does that mean? And the definition side of unmet needs is always a tricky process. Success rate, yes. We often use PTRS as a quantitative measure. So probability of technical and regulatory success, which is a sort of established metric that is often used. There you go, potential for success, PTRS, commercial opportunity. Yep, so I think everyone's on the right lines. So if we were to look at a sample framework that we've used on the commercial side, market size, competitive intensity, payer management, patient advocacy, fit with current or future targeted indications, just some other examples. Disease characteristics, degree of unmet need, regulatory risk, probability of success, scientific risk, potential for clinical differentiation, development cost, just a sample of different criteria that can be used. And then there's a weighting component to this as well. As you see on this slide, commercial attractiveness 50%, development 50%. That's how it is typically set, 50-50. But then within the criteria, the weighting of different criteria is another element or lever to the assessment that can be considered. And for the next two slides, just want to take a quick detour through the competitive side of things in terms of when we talk about competitive intensity. I think the title of this webinar was Indication Prioritization and Competitive Analysis. Again, I don't think there's any real sort of tips and tricks around competitive analysis. It's just taking the time to do the diligence to look at the landscape and make sure that you're looking at it at the sufficient level of sort of granularity and detail. So as an example, this is a slide that we developed looking at cystic fibrosis. So what is the competitive landscape in cystic fibrosis? Now, you could just look at products that are approved in cystic fibrosis and, okay, that's your competitive landscape. True. But those products are not used in the same patients. They're not indicated for the same patients. And so it's important to understand the competitive landscape from a patient perspective as well. In this case, we're looking at age of patient, we're looking at certain mutations and how different products map across those different dimensions. So the point of showing this is just to make the point that, again, looking at things at the level of what products are indicated to treat a specific condition often isn't sufficient to truly understand what the competitive landscape looks like. And then the other side of that is pipeline. Again, not a lot to add here in terms of, well, here's some things you should look at and here's the tips and tricks. Do the work, find out everything that's in development and understand to what extent we anticipate that either products are directly competitive to the product that we're interested in, or where they're not directly competitive, potentially have the opportunity to change treatment dynamics, whether it's through a route of administration, for example, oral versus, in the case of pulmonology, nebulizer, other types of interventions, inhaler that may be in development that could change dynamics that are of importance to other future products. So I just wanted to cover off on that piece just to show, again, 2 examples of the types of information that you'll need to look at from a competitive standpoint. In terms of the scoring, we mentioned earlier that in our eye care example, we chose a very simple scoring mechanism. I'll give you some examples in a bit of a more complicated one. But again, sometimes it doesn't need to be that complicated. In this case, we looked at unmet medical need and breakthrough potential, and we looked at the competitive situation. Here's how we defined each of those. Definitions are important. We use low, medium, and high in this case. You could use a scoring mechanism, 1 through 5, whatever it may be. Again, I think it needs to be sufficiently capable of adapting to all of the different situations that you're going to encounter through these conditions. But at the same time, simplicity is important because it's also important to have the right expectations for what the output of these type of assessments are. I mean, for what it's worth, we often use these types of indication prioritization scoring exercises as more of an elimination exercise versus a prioritization exercise. And what I mean by that is you'll get a spread of conditions when you do this. It's often easier to align and agree on the things that fall off as part of this versus the things that you should really focus on moving forward. That often requires a subsequent discussion and further, often qualitative view. Often that's where the primary research would come in to further prioritize the things that you're interested in. But this is often a very sufficient and good way of eliminating things.
And I will say, kind of the flip side of that, these analyses wander into the realm of false precision relatively quickly when you start to add different components to the scoring. And the way that you interpret the output as really more of a concrete and quantitative, while it is a quantitative process, the output and what you get at the end in some of these charts that we're going to see in just a minute, they're directional, right? You really need to apply common sense and your intuition and a lot of other components to that to use it most effectively.
Exactly. So to give you an example of the framework we often use, here's a 3x3. Again, to make the point that this is more around grouping sets of conditions that provide a similar, almost archetype of opportunity, if you will, than it is identifying specific, to Mike's point, identifying specific things to focus on. Competitive intensity, unmet need, red, yellow, green. Here's how our conditions ended up populating that framework. And in terms of the client interactions we had around this, very broad alignment on the things in the red. Yes, we shouldn't prioritize those. Things in the yellow, some people have very strong opinions around AMD, wet AMD as being a condition that we should prioritize. So then that kicks off another sort of process of discussions and analysis in many respects to understand how we should move forward. But then this becomes a sort of level setting reference exercise for how an objective scoring methodology prioritize certain conditions. In terms of another type of visual, this is something else that another visual that we recently created in oncology around tumor types, path to market, commercial attractiveness. Each of these bubbles represents a specific patient level opportunity within a tumor type. So that's why you see multiple of the same color. You'll see multiple NSCLC, for example, because this was conducted on an individual patient indication level, not the tumor level, again, which is a very important component of these exercises to make sure that you do get a meaningful output. And I think that may be our final slide. So in summary, indication prioritization is a multidisciplinary exercise incorporating commercial, clinical, regulatory, other considerations as well. From our standpoint, when we're working with sort of biopharma client organizations, that means for us, we're often working with a pretty broad group of people. For you, I think it means just ensuring that you integrate those different ways of thinking about something into your assessment, so commercial, clinical, regulatory. As we've defined, it's critical, or as we discussed, sorry, it's critical to define the market appropriately within a disease area, often staying at the level of the broad condition, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, whether it's age-related macular degeneration, whatever it may be. That is often insufficient to get a good output in terms of indication prioritization. We didn't cover primary research in our eye care case study because in this case we didn't do it. We and the client was content with the secondary research driving this assessment. But as we discussed in terms of having appropriate expectations for what these types of exercises deliver, which is broad grouping of opportunities based on their profile, elimination of opportunities, but then identifying a set of indications or opportunities that require further adjudication, if you will. That's often where primary research has a role to play. And we'll often do that as a second phase to this type of assessment. Okay, we've prioritized these 15 different opportunity types. Okay, well, let's take those opportunities out to an external group of opinion leaders, physicians, payers in some cases, and get their perspective on it so that we can ultimately come to well, this is the top 5. These are the top 5 opportunities that we would recommend pursuing. And to that point, the last bullet point here, output is typically used to drive a strategic discussion. So use these appropriately in terms of they're further inputs and further insights to drive ultimate decision making. And that's it. That's what we've got. So any questions?
All right, Q&A box. We've got 6 minutes left in this presentation, so Q&A box is open per usual. Just submit them as they occur to you. We've got first one from Lindsay Williams. What happens if you give informed advice to a company and it turns out poorly, i.e. commercial success, cost, path to market issues? Is this common in the world of consulting?
I mean, I guess that's a tough question to answer. So I will say that in many respects, when we're doing this type of work, it's so early in development that even though I've been doing this for 20 years, it's probably the case that a lot of the information, or a lot of the times that I've given clients recommendations on this type, it still hasn't played out. Right? They're making decisions that to the comment around, this isn't the world of tech, this isn't fail fast, iterate. These are big decisions that have timelines associated with them that are extremely long. So you actually rarely get to see the true output of your work in terms of commercial success. A lot of this work often comes down to prioritization of clinical program targets. So, okay, fine, we will target lung cancer versus prostate cancer on this assessment, right? So it's often hard to then go back and say, well, if we were unsuccessful in lung cancer, the indication prioritization assessment was the flaw in that thinking or the flaw in the process. We would say it wasn't. It was the execution of this strategy in lung cancer that drove that outcome. So this is just the type of project where, given the decisions that it informs and the timelines over which those decisions play out, that you don't often get a good read on specifically the, how right were we, I suppose, from a consulting standpoint. Other project types and other work that we do has a far more immediate sort of success metric in that sense, but not really in this case. Would you agree, Mike?
Well, yeah, and I would say, the insights and the work and the research that we do here, it's done in collaboration with the client. So for the most part, we're coming to these conclusions and making these recommendations in collaboration with the client. And this is just one brick in the wall, right? And there's many, many, many different reasons why drugs fail or things are unsuccessful. And this may, this may be part of the, as we're pointing in the direction of lung cancer or what have you, that may be part of it, but it certainly wouldn't be the sole reason why a program fails or something like that.
Yeah.
Got a question from me is, where do you feel like indication prioritization optimally fits in the technical development of new drugs or applications?
I think as soon as you know that you have something, right? We've conducted these analyses, as projects or just as informal advisors, with companies as they're being set up, as they're coming out of universities. The question of, well, what do I do with this, or where do we focus our effort as our first indication? Right? We can go, one direction or another. How do we think about these things? So these frameworks and these analyses are really helpful, as early as possible. When we're talking about pharma and manufacturers and a little bit further down the road, it all depends on what the strategic question is and the objective of the organization.
Yeah, I think some form of this type of assessment needs to be in place at the earliest decision point, where people are deciding, well, should we put real time or money against this, right? Which is often very, very early, right? And at that stage, it may be something far more simplistic and higher level than we've talked about here. But as soon as you feel like we may have a technology that has some real world application, you should already be thinking about, well, there's multiple ways that we can develop this or take this program. So which way is the right way? And that's pretty early in development. So doesn't necessarily have to be a big in-depth assessment, but some element of this should be integrated as soon as people are framing even hypotheses around the technology.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to say that. Whenever there's time or money involved, you'd want to do something like this.
We've got time enough for one last question. So if you don't mind, we've got the question, how long does it take for you to wrap up a project, let's say for the project presented?
In this case, it was 8 weeks, I think, 2 months. 2 months, 6 to 10 weeks is sort of the typical span, I would say, based on, from our side, the starting point in terms of available information. That's your typical time frame.
It's amazing how many things get done in the 8 to 10 week time frame.
Oh yeah, it's like company valuations. It's amazing how many companies value themselves at $1 billion.
Right. It's all things, most consulting projects, at least the project that we do, are 8 to 10 weeks. So this fits right in there.
And to the question there, that's sort of by design, right? That's how long it takes for any time. If you think of consulting, just broadening that question a little bit, as a problem-solving endeavor, typically it takes about a week or two to really define the problem specifically. It then takes about 4 or 5 weeks to pull all of the information, do all of the work to understand the situation in more detail, and then a week or two to put together whatever sort of recommendations or outputs come from that. So whatever the project is, that sort of 6 to 8 week time frame applies. And the only question from a consulting company standpoint is the resource allocation against that project in order to complete the scope of work in that time frame. But then as a parting thought in terms of indication prioritization, and for the people on this call, this webinar, how to approach it, again, I would emphasize on step one in many respects, which is the process. We talk about often internally, sounds a bit trite, but in terms of, measure twice, cut once, that's a very important element of this, because every assessment, they're all similar, but they're all different. And just being very clear on what you're going to look at and what you're not going to look at, A, will save time, and B, will drive towards better outcomes. So just be clear on your upfront process, and then the rest of it is somewhat intuitive in terms of type of information that you need to pull together. We can share some of the frameworks, happy to share some of the frameworks we use in terms of scoring criteria and everything else. You can find them online. Those types of things follow a pretty similar format, so you can have access to it. The key thing that you'll probably have to decide is, okay, what exactly is the process that I'm going to follow for this technology, and the things that I will look at and the things that I won't. So.
Sounds great. And thank you for committing so much time with us this week, Matt and Mike. This was a really instructive session. Looks like, all right, good. We don't have any further questions. So I think this is just as good of a time to wrap up as any, the actual scheduled time to end the call. So thank you for joining us. And to our guests who have joined us over the web, please join us next week, where we'll be covering pre-compliance, how to get your medical device ready for regulatory approval. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Take care.